Creating an API is relatively simple. In fact, with ASP.NET Core, the scaffolding tools will help me create this API. What I'm going to do is add another folder to this project, a folder with the name of API. I want to keep this separate from the Razor pages and the rest of the application, and I do want an uppercase A in the API. And inside of that folder, what I want to do is add a controller. So I believe that the best way to generate server-side HTML is to use Razor pages. That's the superior technology if you're rendering HTML from the server and you're receiving form posts from the client. However, when it comes time to build an API that returns text or XML or JSON, the clearly superior technology for that is going to be to use controllers from the ASP.NET Core Model View Controller Framework. And what I'm going to do is use the scaffolding tools right now inside of Visual Studio, but you can also do this from the command line. I'm going to use the scaffolding tools to say, yes, go ahead and build me an API controller with actions using the entity framework. So this will be a controller that has the ability to create, read, update, and delete restaurant data. Just like previously in the course, I showed you how you could scaffold out Razor pages that give you CRUD functionality for a given entity. This time we're going to do it, but for an API. So my model is going to be my odefood.core.restaurant. My data context class is going to be the odefood DB context that we created earlier. And the controller that I want to create will be the restaurant controller. That's going to be the name of the controller. I'm going to click Add, and we'll take a look at this code and see how this behaves here in just a moment. But in ASP.NET Core, a controller and a Razor page, they're very conceptually similar. I can use either a controller or a Razor page to respond to an HTTP request. It's just that Razor pages are better suited to produce an HTML response, whereas MVC controllers, they can also respond to HTTP, but they are better suited for building APIs that return JSON or XML. All a controller is a class that derives from a base class, controller base. Just like a Razor page, a controller can receive dependencies via dependency injection. So you can see we are injecting the entity framework DB context into this controller once the MVC framework has determined that this controller is needed and has to be instantiated. And at that point, very similar to Razor pages, I'm going to have methods, which we will refer to as actions, that respond to different types of HTTP requests. So if I have a GET request for /API/restaurants, which is what we're trying to do from jQuery, that's going to invoke this method getRestaurants, which will return all the restaurants that are in my DB context. So for right now, we're not going to worry about paging and sorting. We're going to imagine that there's a manageable number of restaurants in the database. Down here's another method. This method's going to respond to a request like /API/restaurants/5 and return a single restaurant that matches this by ID, so the restaurant with an ID of 5. The code's going to be very similar to the code that we wrote for the Razor page that shows the details for a single restaurant. I also have methods that will respond to an HTTP put request to put a restaurant, that is, update an existing restaurant. There will also be a method that responds to an HTTP post request. When building an API, a post request is typically what we use to create a new resource, create an entity. So this is going to create a new restaurant. This is slightly different than forms programming, where we use a post request to do both create and update. When you design an API, you typically make more use of HTTP methods and HTTP status codes. So there's other courses here on Pluralsight that will go through in more detail building APIs with ASP.NET Core. This is just a quick introduction. And I just want to demonstrate that indeed, if I go to /API/restaurants, I should be able to see restaurant information even if I do that from my browser. So let me open up another tab. And now I want to copy /API/restaurants. Let's go to that here on the server. And indeed, I can see all my restaurant information being returned, but as a JSON array. And if I go to /API/restaurants/2, I will see just a single restaurant, the restaurant that has an ID of 2. So our API endpoint appears to be working correctly. And let's just see what happens now if we come back to our client restaurants page and do a refresh. You might remember inside of the then callback for my AJAX call, I did a console.dir on the response that came back from the web server, and indeed here in the browser I can see we're logging out the 3 restaurants that came back as the result of an API call. So now I know that the code inside of client restaurants, or the JavaScript code, is working correctly. I'm calling the API, I'm getting back some JSON data, the JSON data is legible. Now I just need to figure out how to format that data into something that the end user would like to see.